The worst part was realizing that I had underestimated her from the very beginning. When Sylvia first started sending those nitpicky letters, about the hedge, the paint on my shutters, the wildflowers growing too enthusiastically near the mailbox, I chalked it up to classic HOA behavior. A bit overzealous, sure, but nothing I hadn't heard horror stories about from friends in other neighborhoods. I thought maybe if I complied with the minor requests, trimmed the hedge to regulation height, and stayed off her radar, she'd get bored and move on to someone else. But that's not what happened. With Sylvia, compliance wasn't an end, it was an invitation. Every small concession I made only emboldened her more. She wasn't trying to maintain order. She was testing how far she could push. And I had failed that test in every possible way. By the time the letter demanding the removal of my eucalyptus trees arrived, it wasn't even a surprise. Somewhere deep in my gut, I had seen it coming, even if I didn't want to believe it. The wording of the letter was classic Sylvia, cold, formal, and dripping with passive-aggressive righteousness. She cited obscure bylaws about sightlines and aesthetic cohesion, claiming that the trees created visual disruption to the community and failed to align with Willow Creek's landscaping standards. It was absurd. The only things these trees were disrupting were her rigid standards and maybe the view from the street, if you could call the sight of sterile beige garage doors a view worth preserving. The eucalyptus trees weren't just decorative. They were the soul of that property. Some of them had stood for over 100 years. They had deep roots, literally and metaphorically. I remember reading once that eucalyptus roots can grow downward more than 100 feet in search of water. These trees had survived decades of droughts, lightning storms, and God knows what else. They'd stood tall before the first brick was laid in Willow Creek Estates. And now, some clipboard-wielding control freak wanted them gone because they didn't match the neighborhood color palette? It felt like an insult to nature itself. But beyond that, it felt deeply personal. Sylvia wasn't just enforcing rules. She was waging war against individuality. Against anything wild or untamed or different. And my cabin, with its worn wood siding, rusted weather vane, and canopy of ancient eucalyptus, was a direct challenge to everything she stood for. I had the only property in the entire neighborhood that hadn't been scrubbed clean and bleached to match some suburban blueprint. And instead of respecting that, she saw it as a blemish on her perfect little spreadsheet of compliance. When I first bought the place, I imagined that maybe one day I'd retire there. I dreamed of planting a garden beneath the trees, building a small outdoor studio where I could work on my photography and architectural sketches in peace. The trees weren't just part of the scenery, they were part of the dream. They gave the land character, history, a sense of permanence that's rare in a world where everything gets torn down and rebuilt every few decades. I thought, naively, that everyone would see them the way I did. But Sylvia wasn't everyone. What followed that letter was an escalating campaign that would have made a seasoned prosecutor proud. First came the fines, one after another. Some were for the hedge, others for so-called unauthorized natural overgrowth. One was for a pile of firewood stacked too high, even though it had been there untouched since the day I moved in. Then there were the inspections. Sylvia would show up with 2 other HOA board members, always unannounced, always holding clipboards, and they'd walk around my property like surveyors mapping a crime scene. They'd jot notes, snap photos, murmur to each other, and then vanish without a word. At first, I tried to stay civil. I attended the monthly HOA meetings, thinking maybe I could reason with them. But Sylvia controlled those meetings like a courtroom judge on a power trip. Public comment was limited to 2 minutes per speaker. Objections were ignored or written off as emotional. I once tried to bring up the trees, arguing that they added to the property value and protected the soil from erosion. But Sylvia shot me down with a curt reminder that environmental considerations fall outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The rest of the board just sat there in silence, nodding along like well-trained deputies. It didn't help that most of my neighbors had fallen into line years ago. They'd either had the fight beaten out of them or never cared in the first place. One elderly couple down the road actually told me they liked the neatness Sylvia brought to the community. No surprises, you know, the husband said with a shrug. Another neighbor told me privately, "Look, man, I love your trees, but you're never going to win against her. She'll bury you in paperwork." They weren't wrong. The amount of documentation Sylvia had amassed on my property was staggering. One day, purely out of curiosity, I filed a formal request to view the HOA records related to my address. What I got back was a binder, an actual 3-inch binder, full of citations, notes, meeting transcripts, and photographs. She'd been documenting everything: what days I visited the cabin, how long I stayed, whether the porch light had been left on too long, even the license plates of my guests. It was obsessive. And more than a little unsettling. I started to feel like I was being watched. Not just by Sylvia, but by the community itself. A few people who used to wave when I arrived stopped acknowledging me altogether. I'd find passive-aggressive notes on my cabin door, things like "Please respect the community standards," or "Maybe you belong in the mountains, not here." It was like some twisted version of a neighborhood watch, but instead of protecting the community, they were enforcing conformity. Still, I held out hope that logic might prevail. I wrote a detailed rebuttal to the tree removal order, citing environmental studies, photographs of erosion prevention benefits, even passages from the original property survey that described the eucalyptus grove as a defining natural feature. I sent it by certified mail and delivered a copy by hand to the HOA office. I never got a response. Instead, one morning I drove up to the cabin and found orange spray-painted excess on every single tree. It felt like a death sentence. I called the HOA immediately and demanded to speak to Sylvia. She wasn't in. I asked when she'd return. They didn't know. I told them no one had the right to mark trees on private property without my permission. The receptionist just repeated that all actions are in accordance with the community bylaws. The trees were cut down 3 days later. I wasn't even there when it happened. A neighbor called me at work and said, "I'm sorry, Marcus, but there's a crew on your property with chainsaws. They're taking them all down." I drove faster than I ever had in my life, heart pounding the whole way. But by the time I arrived, the damage was done. The landscape I'd fallen in love with, the towering eucalyptus trees, the dappled light, the sense of sacred stillness, was gone. In their place were stumps and sawdust. The cabin looked exposed. Naked. Like someone had peeled back its soul. And Sylvia? She stood at the end of the street, watching. No clipboard that day. Just her, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing on her lips like justice had been served. I wanted to scream. To cry. To throw something. But I didn't. I just stood there, hands in fists, staring at the graveyard of what used to be my sanctuary. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. Couldn't believe that one person's obsession with control could so completely erase something so ancient, so meaningful. But if Sylvia thought she'd won, she was wrong. Because 2 weeks later, everything changed. Underscore 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 underscore. What I didn't realize, until it was far too late, was that I had essentially signed away my property rights the moment I purchased the cabin in Willow Creek Estates. At the time, buried deep within the towering stack of paperwork, mortgage agreements, title deeds, insurance disclosures, and yes, the HOA charter, I'd glossed over the section outlining what the homeowners association could and couldn't control. It looked like standard legal boilerplate, the kind of thing you skim and assume is just a formality. I never imagined it would one day be used as a weapon. But that's exactly what Sylvia did. She wielded the HOA contract like a scalpel, precise, cold, and absolutely devastating. It was as though she'd memorized every clause, every obscure bylaw, and every procedural loophole. She didn't just enforce rules, she mined them for tactical advantage. It was never about safety or property values. It was about control. And now, her warpath had turned toward the one thing I cherished most, the grove of century-old eucalyptus trees that made my cabin feel like a sanctuary instead of just another lot in a grid of sameness. The breaking point came one damp Thursday evening, when Sylvia called what she labeled an emergency HOA meeting to address ongoing non-conforming landscaping issues that continue to impact community standards. Her phrasing, as always, was precise and sterile, but the real meaning was clear: she was coming for my trees. And foolishly, I went. I remember walking into the Willow Creek Community Center that night, still clutching a folder of photographs, images of the trees at sunset, studies of their shadows dancing on the cabin walls, even some local wildlife that made their home among the roots. I truly believed that logic and beauty might win the day. That maybe, just maybe, if I showed how much these trees contributed to the environment, to the soul of the property, I could convince her, and the rest of the board, that they were worth preserving. But the meeting wasn't a discussion. It was a trial. The room had been arranged like a courtroom, with Sylvia perched at the head table, presiding like a judge in a black robe. Only instead of a robe, she wore one of those tailored, authority-colored blazers and had her usual clipboard sitting neatly beside her like a courtroom stenographer. She had her signature gavel in hand, a wooden thing polished to a shine, and I swear the sound it made when she struck it was amplified when I tried to speak. Like it had been my seat up to silence dissent. When my turn came to address the board, I stood behind the small podium and tried to keep my voice steady. I spoke from the heart. I told them how the eucalyptus trees weren't just landscaping, they were history. They were the guardians of the land, older than any house on the street, living relics of what the area once was. I talked about erosion prevention, about the cooling shade they offered, about their role as windbreakers and their deep-rooted connection to the land. I even offered alternative compromises, professional trimming, inspections, arborist reports. But none of it mattered. Sylvia cut me off with rule after rule. Bylaw 12.4, subsection B, tree height compliance under clause 7.3. Visual impact statement under article 9.1. It was like arguing with a fax machine, only colder. No matter what I said, she had an obscure regulation to shut it down. And each time she used that gavel, it hit the wood like a judge slamming a prison sentence. It echoed louder with my words than with anyone else's. It felt calculated, like her whole mission that evening was to put me in my place. I walked home from that meeting numb. My hands were trembling, my folder of photographs crumpled under my arm like evidence rejected in court. I'd never felt so utterly defeated as an adult. Not when I'd missed out on my dream job. Not when I'd gone through my worst breakup. This was different. This was a kind of institutional defeat, realizing that I was powerless in the face of someone who had all the tools, all the authority, and a whole system backing her up. It wasn't just a matter of logic anymore. It was about leverage. She had it, and I didn't. I remember sitting down at my desk that night, opening my laptop, and pouring my rage into an email. It wasn't diplomatic. It was raw. I detailed every dirty tactic she'd used, every time she'd ignored logic in favor of domination, every hypocritical move she'd made to maintain her iron grip on the neighborhood. I called her out for what she was, a petty tyrant hiding behind official language and weaponized bureaucracy. But halfway through typing it, I realized the futility of it all. Even if I hit send, nothing would change. She'd file it away, maybe even use it as evidence of hostile correspondence in her next action against me. So I deleted the draft. I started another email, tried to be calmer, more measured. But halfway through, my anger boiled over again. I slammed my fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the quiet of the cabin. The vibration knocked over a framed photograph on the shelf, one of my favorite shots of the eucalyptus canopy in morning light. That photo made me pause. Made me wonder if this was what losing truly looked like, knowing you're right, knowing your cause is noble and justified, but watching the world go along with the lie anyway. After that night, things got worse. Subtler, yes, but worse. People stopped making eye contact. Neighbors who once waved or stopped to chat suddenly found their shoelaces fascinating whenever I passed. Even the guy with the tacky plastic flamingos, the one Sylvia had publicly chastised in a newsletter, crossed the street to avoid me. No one wanted to be associated with me. I was the troublemaker now. The dissenter. The one challenging the system. And Sylvia had made sure everyone knew that. Some whispered their support. Quiet comments in parking lots. A nod of solidarity in the mailroom. "We're with you, man," one neighbor murmured, glancing over his shoulder like a spy behind enemy lines. But no one was willing to say it out loud. Not at meetings. Not in emails. Not in front of Sylvia. Everyone was afraid. Afraid of being targeted next. Afraid of the fines, the inspections, the endless letters written in that unnervingly polite tone that masked real threats under layers of paper. Then came her final letter. The one that broke whatever illusion I still had that she was just doing her job. It was clinical, as always. A printed map was attached. A zoning map, supposedly confirming that there were no legal protections for the trees on my property. And on the surface, it seemed airtight. But something about that map bothered me. I couldn't explain it at first. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. The coloring was a little off. The paper had a slightly yellow tint. And the date in the corner? 1992. She was using a map that was over 30 years old to justify tree removal in 2025. That's when I ran into Walter. Walter lived 3 doors down, a retired water engineer with a stoop full of bird feeders and a garden that bloomed like clockwork. We didn't talk much. But that afternoon, as I trudged past his place clutching Sylvia's latest letter, he was outside watering his hydrangeas. I must have looked like hell, because he squinted and said, "Something wrong?" I laughed bitterly and waved the map in the air. Just Sylvia being Sylvia. He nodded slowly, then said something that stopped me cold. I remember FEMA marking this zone decades ago. This whole area was flagged as a floodplain. I stared at him. Are you sure? Positive, he said. Used to be part of my job. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the old map again. If Walter was right, and he wasn't the type to misremember details, then Sylvia hadn't just bent the truth. She'd buried it. If the area had been marked as a federal flood zone, there were regulations that superseded local HOA control. Protections. Potential restrictions. Maybe even grants for preservation. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. Hope. But that glimmer vanished the next morning. I was staying at the cabin that weekend, trying to regroup, trying to think. And then I heard it, this awful, mechanical roar. Chainsaws. Multiple chainsaws. At first, I thought it must be construction nearby. But then I saw the shadows through the curtains. Men with helmets and saws, moving with ruthless precision. I stumbled to the window, and froze. They were cutting down my eucalyptus trees. All of them. I couldn't move. Couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. I watched helplessly as the giants fell, one by one, each crash shaking the ground like a death knell. My legs felt like stone. My body refused to function. I just stood there, numb, while my sanctuary was reduced to rubble. And 3 hours later, when the last stump was ground into dust, I received an email from Sylvia. She billed me $1,200 for landscaping services. Nobody wanted to be Sylvia's next target, and I couldn't really blame them. She had a reputation for crushing dissent with bureaucratic precision, turning neighborhood pride into a weapon, and it worked. The people of Willow Creek Estates had learned to keep their heads down. After all, no one wants to be the subject of a complaint letter, a fine, or worse, public shaming at the HOA meeting. She ruled like a monarch. But even if I understood their silence, it still felt like abandonment. I'd spent years here building a life, nurturing the land around my cabin like it was part of me. When that was taken from me, all I wanted was someone to stand beside me and say, "This isn't right." No one did. I was alone. The worst part? When I finally started digging through the paperwork, trying to figure out if I could fight back, I discovered a truth even more bitter than my isolation. The HOA contract, the very document we'd all sign like it was a harmless formality, gave them frightening power. Pages of dense legal jargon painted a picture I could hardly believe. I wasn't sure if I was misinterpreting it or just naive, but it looked like I'd effectively signed away my right to object. The contract gave the HOA sweeping authority to maintain the integrity of community standards, which apparently included cutting down 100-year-old trees that shaded and protected my land. It was all there in black and white, wrapped in language so deliberately convoluted I wondered how many of us had actually understood what we were agreeing to when we bought our homes. That's when Walter showed up at my door. He looked out of place on my porch, holding a weathered brown briefcase that seemed like it belonged to another century. I hadn't expected visitors, especially not Walter, who I only knew in passing from HOA meetings and the occasional wave across the street. He was always polite, always quiet, a man who seemed content tending to his garden and staying out of neighborhood politics. I assumed he was just another silent observer. But the look on his face told me otherwise. His eyes held a kind of urgency, the kind that didn't match his age or his normally reserved demeanor. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice low but firm. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, unsure of what this was about but too intrigued to say no. He walked straight to the kitchen table like he already knew the layout of the place, set the briefcase down, and opened it with the slow reverence of a man handling sacred relics. Inside were papers, maps, stamped documents, and faded photographs. Some of the files looked like they hadn't seen daylight in decades. "I used to work for FEMA," he explained. "Water Engineering Division. Back in the 70s and 80s. I helped draft the original flood zone mapping for this entire region." I blinked at him, unsure of how to respond. "Walter? FEMA?" It was like finding out your quiet neighbor had been an astronaut or a spy. But the documents he laid out in front of me told the story clearly enough. They were authentic, old, yes, but official. Some bore the unmistakable blue FEMA seal. Others were environmental studies, engineering reports, and legal statutes. It took a moment for me to process the implications of what he was showing me. "Your property, along with most of the cabin lots in Willow Creek, sits in a designated FEMA flood control zone," he said. "Has since 1974. He pointed to a spot on one of the maps, where my parcel of land was shaded in green. The legend read, "Natural Flood Buffer Area, Protected Vegetation Zone." I stared at it, stunned. I'd never seen these maps before. No one had ever mentioned anything about this designation when I bought the cabin. But Walter had the receipts, so to speak. And the deeper he dug into the files, the clearer it all became. These trees, especially eucalyptus, are considered essential infrastructure in zones like this, he continued. They prevent soil erosion, manage water runoff, keep downstream communities from flooding during heavy storms. He looked at me then, his expression grave. Cutting them down without an environmental impact study, without federal approval, is a serious violation. Sylvia didn't just break HOA rules. What she did might actually be illegal under federal law. For a long time, I couldn't speak. The weight of what he just told me settled over me like a physical burden. My fight to save my trees had never felt like anything more than a personal struggle, a painful, lonely battle against a petty tyrant. But now it was something much bigger. Those trees weren't just beautiful. They weren't just mine. They were part of a delicate, federally protected ecosystem. And Sylvia had destroyed it, all in the name of community standards. Suddenly, I wasn't just a grieving homeowner. I was holding proof. I had maps, studies, legal codes, all stamped and signed by the very government Sylvia loved to quote when it suited her purposes. I had power now, maybe even a weapon that could match hers. But I also had fear. Because what did I know about navigating federal law? About filing reports and launching investigations? Would the government care about one homeowner in a quiet suburban development? Would they even take me seriously? And what if they did? What if they brought the hammer down on our entire neighborhood? Walter seemed to sense my hesitation. He leaned across the table and said, gently, Marcus, those trees weren't just for you. They protected all of us. They were part of the system. You have a responsibility now. I nodded slowly, though my stomach was churning. It was one thing to rage at an unjust HOA president. It was another to potentially trigger a federal investigation that could impact the entire neighborhood. But every time I looked outside and saw those stumps, those jagged, lifeless reminders of what had been, I felt the need for justice burn hotter in my chest. That night, I barely slept. I pored over the FEMA regulations Walter had flagged, reading until my eyes blurred. The law was shockingly clear. Natural terrain in designated flood control zones couldn't be altered without federal review. Removing old-growth trees with extensive root systems, like the one Sylvia had destroyed, definitely counted as an alteration. And the penalty? Fines, restoration orders, even criminal liability in some cases. It was all there, plain as day. But what scared me wasn't the clarity of the law. It was the process. Filing a formal complaint, navigating the bureaucracy, potentially going to court, it felt overwhelming. And there was always the chance it could backfire. What if they investigated me for something? What if they seized my property for being in non-compliance, even though I hadn't done anything? The fear of losing what little I had left paralyzed me. I picked up the phone a dozen times, only to set it down again. What if I made everything worse? But I couldn't ignore that feeling, that burning need for justice. So I came up with a plan. A strategy. Desperate, maybe. Risky, definitely. But it was the best I had. I didn't contact FEMA as Marcus Reed, disgruntled homeowner. I created a new email account, willowcreek.citizens.alert@gmail.com. I drafted a message carefully, phrasing it like a collective concern from multiple residents. I didn't lie, I just left out that there was only one person behind the keyboard. I laid out the facts, quoted the FEMA designations, attached the old maps Walter had shared. I wrote it like a whistleblower report, calm and concerned, not angry or accusatory. I wanted it to sound like it came from a group. Because if Sylvia had taught me anything, it was that appearances matter. A united front always carries more weight than a single voice shouting in the dark. The final email read like this. Dear FEMA Environmental Compliance Division. We are writing as concerned residents of Willow Creek Estates regarding a recent incident that may violate federal flood control protections. Several trees with documented root systems that serve erosion prevention purposes were removed by our HOA leadership without an environmental impact study or any federal oversight. These trees were located in an area marked on FEMA floodplain maps as a designated natural barrier zone. We respectfully request that this issue be reviewed for potential non-compliance with FEMA regulations concerning natural flood control infrastructure. Documents and maps attached. Thank you for your attention. I read the email 5 times before clicking send. My heart pounded. I felt like I'd crossed a line, one I couldn't come back from. But the moment it was gone, a strange calm settled over me. And when Officer Cooper from FEMA called 2 days later, he sounded exactly as I expected, exhausted, skeptical, bored. But as I began explaining what had happened, something in his tone shifted. The minute I mentioned Flood Zone 47B and referenced the federal map codes, he stopped me. "Can you resend those documents right now?" he asked. That's when I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Underscore 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 underscore. The first time I dialed the number, I genuinely didn't think anything would come of it. I imagined being passed from department to department, each person a little more indifferent than the last, until finally someone forgot to put me on hold and I just sat there listening to an empty line. I expected the usual, vague sympathies, maybe a case number scribbled on a sticky note that would never leave a desk drawer. I braced for all of it. But instead, something happened, something I didn't quite anticipate. At first, the man on the phone, a civil servant named Cooper, sounded exactly like I feared. Monotone voice, disinterested responses, asking me to repeat things I'd already explained 3 times. It was clear he was halfway through his shift, likely halfway through his coffee too, and was just waiting out the clock. I almost hung up out of sheer frustration. But then I remembered what Walter had told me. Walter, bless him, had been part of a local conservation board before retirement and understood the strange language that actually moved mountains in government agencies. He'd sat me down over beers on his back porch and said, "They don't care about your anger. What they care about is liability, risk, federal compliance." He handed me a yellowed manila folder filled with terms I barely understood. Keywords, statutes, enforcement protocols. It all felt excessive at the time. But I trusted him. So, on that call, instead of venting about how Sylvia had torn up the trees I loved or how I no longer felt at home in my own backyard, I calmly used the words Walter had flagged in bold ink: cabin property, designated flood zone, unauthorized tree removal, erosion risk, loss of root structure. I watched the words land. The change in Cooper's tone was immediate and almost shocking. It was like I'd flipped a switch. I could hear it in the way he adjusted in his seat, the way his breath caught ever so slightly before he asked me to repeat the address. It was no longer a bored employee checking boxes. He was alert, sharp. It was like I had unknowingly uttered some kind of bureaucratic incantation, magic words that unlocked an entirely different reality. In a matter of seconds, Cooper transformed from a passive listener into an investigator. He began asking highly specific questions. When had the trees been removed? What was the species? How old were they? Did I have photographs? Had I observed changes in the water runoff pattern near the slope? He even asked about neighboring properties and whether I'd seen sediment accumulation near the drainage easement. I did my best to keep up, flipping through the notes Walter had helped me prepare. The moment I said the eucalyptus trees were over 100 years old and situated in what FEMA had previously labeled as a flood mitigation zone, Cooper's voice turned clipped, almost surgical. That's when I realized I'd struck something deeper than neighborhood politics. I wasn't just complaining anymore, I was reporting a possible federal violation. And Cooper made it clear, FEMA took these kinds of infractions very seriously. When mature trees are removed from protected areas, it isn't just about aesthetics or shade. It's about the downstream effects, literally, flood control, soil integrity, the protection of watersheds that supply entire regions. Cooper explained that removing natural flood barriers without an environmental impact review wasn't just ill-advised, it could be illegal under multiple codes, and that property owners, HOAs, and any governing body involved could face severe penalties. The fact that this happened on a cabin parcel, a term that apparently raised every red flag in the book, meant that the federal government had jurisdiction. He promised to escalate the matter and said that a field team would likely be dispatched to conduct an on-site assessment within a few days. When I hung up, I felt dazed. Elated, yes, but also terrified. Hope had been such a foreign emotion lately that I wasn't sure how to process it. For months, I'd felt like a minor character in my own story, barely able to push back against the absurd tyranny of an HOA president obsessed with conformity and control. Now, for the first time, I felt something shift. But hope is a dangerous thing when you've spent so long doubting whether the rules apply to people like Sylvia. 3 days later, I was on my porch sipping lukewarm coffee when the SUVs rolled in. Not just any SUVs, matte black, federally marked, and uncomfortably sleek, the kind you'd see in a disaster film right before someone says, "You need to evacuate the area." I actually spilled coffee on myself out of shock. They didn't just pull up, they deployed. Each vehicle fanned out to different parts of the cabin lots. Doors swung open with mechanical precision, and out stepped men and women in dark windbreakers emblazoned with the FEMA insignia, carrying gear that looked straight out of a sci-fi thriller. They had everything: surveyor tripods, LiDAR scanners, tablet rigs, drone consoles. One guy even had a cylindrical sampling probe that he drove into the soil like he was taking a core sample on Mars. They moved with clinical precision, ignoring the slow, gathering tide of neighbors watching from behind curtains or pretending to water potted plants. It was a sight to behold, our tiny, squabbling, overly landscaped neighborhood now the focus of a full-scale federal environmental inspection. They took samples from every visible tree stump on my property, even measured the grade of the slope where the roots had once held firm. Their drones flew overhead in tight, purposeful circles, capturing the contours of the terrain in ways I didn't fully understand but knew had meaning. They weren't here to mediate a neighborly disagreement. They were here to determine whether federal law had been broken. Sylvia's reaction, when she saw the SUVs, was pure theater. She had been outside fussing over her cactus bed. Yes, she grew cacti like they were endangered artifacts, when the FEMA team appeared at the cul-de-sac. She turned, watering can in hand, and when her eyes locked onto that federal seal, her entire body stiffened. The can slipped from her fingers and clattered on the stones like a dropped weapon. I wish I could say I didn't enjoy the moment. But I did. She scrambled. Within hours, she posted an official clarification in the Willow Creek newsletter claiming FEMA was conducting a routine inspection in collaboration with the HOA. It would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. Cooper responded the next morning with an official memo posted to every resident's door. FEMA does not coordinate environmental enforcement with private homeowner associations. The message couldn't have been clearer. For 2 days, Sylvia all but disappeared. The same woman who used to patrol our lawns like a self-appointed sheriff was now a ghost behind drawn blinds. But I saw her, pacing her living room like an animal trapped in its own lair, on the phone non-stop, gesturing wildly. I imagined her calling every contact she had, every city official, every lawyer willing to pick up. But this time, there was no fixing it with charm or manipulation. This wasn't the HOA playbook anymore. This was federal. That Friday, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Normally, these things drew a dozen retirees and the occasional nosy neighbor. But this time, it was packed, standing room only. Even folks I hadn't seen in months showed up. Something in the air had changed. People wanted answers. Sylvia took the podium, trying to spin it all as a paperwork error, some minor oversight involving cabin lot records. But her voice was thin, her eyes darting nervously toward the entrance every few minutes. The crowd wasn't buying it. Then Mrs. Clara, a retired school teacher who'd never spoken at a single meeting in 20 years, stood up and asked plainly, "Is it true the removed trees were part of a designated flood control system?" The room went silent. Sylvia blanched. That was my moment. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but I steadied my voice and said the words I knew would hit like thunder. FEMA is investigating this community for environmental violations. The removal of those trees may have compromised flood protections for every home in this zone. You could feel the room shift. Eyes turned to Sylvia, whose face went from flushed to pale in seconds. She opened her mouth, closed it again. She looked like she'd swallowed a stone. For once, people weren't just listening, they were seeing. Seeing the destruction, the arrogance, the years of unchecked authority finally catching up to her. She tried to deflect, accusing me of inciting panic, but no one was listening anymore. The power was gone. 3 days later, the official FEMA notice arrived in every mailbox. Underscore 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 underscore. Reading that official notice, I felt like I was holding a live bomb. No, a lip bomb, absurdly delicate and ready to detonate in either direction. I wasn't sure if it would explode in Sylvia's face or somehow blow up in mine, taking my credibility and sanity with it. But one thing was clear, the stakes had shifted. This wasn't neighborhood drama anymore. This was federal. I started noticing subtle shifts almost immediately. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid eye contact now nodded at me, tight-lipped but purposeful. Some offered quick glances of approval, while others simply moved aside as if acknowledging that something larger was at play. It was like the weather in Willow Creek Estates had changed. Sylvia's reign wasn't over yet, but the cracks were visible, spreading like hairline fractures through porcelain. What came next wasn't just a meeting, it was a full-blown reckoning, a collision between small-town bureaucracy and federal force. FEMA's mandatory community session turned the sleepy Willow Creek Community Center into the setting of a public tribunal. People who had never shown their faces at a single HOA gathering in 10 years were suddenly in the front row with notebooks and furrowed brows. Some even brought folding chairs because the rows were packed. I couldn't help but notice the nervous rustle of printed agendas and the buzz of whispered speculation. Officer Cooper didn't walk in like a government drone. He walked in like someone delivering testimony, calm, methodical, unshakably composed. He brought charts, maps, printed environmental impact reports, aerial drone footage, and enough technical documentation to fill a legal briefcase and a half. It was intimidating not because it was loud, but because it was precise. It felt like watching a scalpel dismantle a tumor. Efficient. Surgical. He started with a history lesson. The cabin properties, he explained, had been part of a federally protected flood control zone since 1974. There were records to prove it. Environmental impact studies. Federal registry entries. Legal documentation. All of it signed, stamped, archived. It was all there, just never shared with the community. And certainly never acknowledged by the HOA president who had greenlit the mass tree removal. The drone footage came next, silent video from the sky revealing patches of newly bald earth where eucalyptus trees had stood for over a century. These weren't just trees, they were structural parts of the watershed, vital to holding the soil, controlling runoff, and shielding the downstream communities from seasonal flooding. Then came the kicker, the soil erosion. Cooper pointed to a red circle on one of the aerial photos and said, "That's the perimeter of compromised terrain. This is only the beginning. If we don't intervene, the erosion will escalate with each rainfall, potentially causing downstream flooding in less than 2 seasons." He used terms like watershed integrity and natural infrastructure, words that made everyone sit up straighter because they meant something much bigger than trees. This was about public safety, federal regulation, and environmental consequences far beyond our zip code. And then, the number. The financial hit. Cooper explained that an authorized removal of federally protected flood barriers came with a penalty of $85,000, plus mandatory replanting to federal standards, and mandatory oversight of all future landscaping activities on those properties. $85,000. The number hung in the room like a fire alarm. At first, it didn't even register. Then, like a wave, the impact landed. Some gasped audibly. Others blinked in disbelief. I saw one older man whisper, "That's more than I make in a year." Even Sylvia froze. Her pen stopped mid-scribble. Her face, once rigid with control, now flickered with something else, uncertainty. But Cooper wasn't done. He explained that because the violation compromised flood protection for the entire downstream area, every future landscaping decision, every hedge, every root, every blade of grass, on cabin property land would now need a federal environmental impact assessment. FEMA was here to stay. That's when the temperature in the room changed. Sylvia had been sitting stiffly at the head table, trying to maintain her usual pose of rigid authority, but her mask was slipping. She tried to cut in, her voice overly chipper, saying things like, "Clearly a misunderstanding. We were acting in the community's safety interests." But no one bought it. She tried pivoting, blaming community members for requesting the tree removals. She even pointed fingers at the environmental consultants, calling them unclear and confusing. But Cooper never flinched. His tone never changed. Regardless of any informal discussions, the federal designation of these trees as protected flood barriers means their removal was a direct violation of environmental law, he stated flatly. Sylvia's eyes widened. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the table. Her lips trembled as she searched for the right combination of denial and deflection. But nothing worked. And then, she cracked. Her face flushed crimson. Her voice, usually tight and practiced, became high-pitched and erratic. "This is an outrage," she shouted, pointing at Cooper. "This is government overreach. It's a trap. Marcus set this up to sabotage me." The room fell into a stunned silence. All eyes turned toward me. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I'd said nothing, done nothing, but Sylvia's meltdown was speaking volumes. "You can't protect every cabin tree," she shrieked. "These are just trees. On private property." But Cooper simply stood still, watching her unravel. His composure, so calm, so unaffected, only made her look worse. It was excruciating to watch. Not because I felt pity, but because I was watching someone's entire illusion collapse in real time. The woman who had weaponized the HOA charter against backyard garden boxes and porch flags was now completely helpless against the weight of real law. Her control had always been performative. And now the performance was over. That's when Mrs. Clara stood up. She was one of the oldest residents in Willow Creek and rarely spoke at meetings. But now, she raised her voice. "Sylvia," she said quietly but firmly, "did you know about the federal protections when you approved the tree removals?" Sylvia froze. The room held its breath. I was acting in the best interests of. That's not what I asked. The silence returned. Clara turned to the crowd. "I move for an immediate no-confidence vote to remove Sylvia from the HOA board, effective tonight." The motion was seconded almost before the words had left her mouth. Sylvia stood up and screamed, "I have emails. I have proof Marcus was behind this." Nobody cared. Nobody asked to see them. Even her few remaining allies, if she had any, avoided her gaze. It didn't feel like a vote. It felt like an exorcism. The count was fast and brutal. 4 to 7 votes for removal. 3 abstentions. 0 in her favor. And that was it. Sylvia Reed, HOA president, community enforcer, garden gate tyrant, was finished. She didn't speak again. She just stood there, trembling, her bun half unraveled, hands clutching at the table like it might save her from drowning. And then, slowly, she walked toward the door. She turned to glare at me one last time, a look of pure venom that once might have frightened me. But now? Now, it looked like a sad echo of the power she used to wield. She was defeated, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't done. Not truly. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe I'd been fighting this battle so long that I couldn't believe it was really over. But there was something about her final look, part hate, part warning, that made me think her chapter hadn't closed yet. And if that was true, I'd be ready. That final look Sylvia gave me wasn't the glance of someone gracefully bowing out. It was sharp, venomous, and unsettling, as though she couldn't believe that everything she had built was now slipping through her fingers. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite her public humiliation and fall from grace, she wasn't done. People like Sylvia rarely are. They don't go quietly, and they certainly don't accept being held accountable without plotting some kind of comeback. But for now, the tide had turned, and I could finally breathe in my own neighborhood again. The aftermath of her collapse was swift and seismic. Within days, the woman who had once lorded over Willow Creek estates like a suburban dictator had become someone no one wanted to be associated with. Neighbors who used to defer to her opinions now crossed the street to avoid her. The HOA board, once her fortress of control, was gutted and rebuilt from the ground up with newly elected members who were actually willing to listen, compromise, and, perhaps most importantly, treat the rest of us like human beings instead of unruly tenants under autocratic rule. Mrs. Clara, who had spoken up during the infamous FEMA meeting, was elected HOA president by a landslide. Her first act in office? A full review of every bylaw, rule, and regulation that Sylvia had implemented during her reign. Over a dozen arbitrary and excessively punitive policies were immediately repealed, and what was left was condensed into a simple, clear 2-page document that focused on safety, respect, and environmental responsibility rather than lawn height and mailbox uniformity. It was a revolution in paper form, and it came not a moment too soon. The promised FEMA oversight, far from being a burden, turned out to be one of the best things that had ever happened to the neighborhood. The federal environmental experts didn't just impose rules, they offered solutions, education, and resources. Instead of viewing the land like a nuisance to be conquered and controlled, they treated it as a living system, teaching us about watershed preservation, erosion control, and native plant benefits. With their guidance, we began to see the land not just as property, but as shared responsibility. Suddenly, landscaping wasn't just about looks, it was about legacy. Even the lawns started to change. Gone were the obsessively manicured, chemically treated squares of artificial perfection. In their place grew more natural, varied, and beautiful environments, spaces where birds returned, bees thrived, and children played freely again. It was like our community had finally remembered how to live. People talked more, laughed more. The tension that had blanketed every HOA meeting under Sylvia's rule evaporated like morning mist under the sun. But the fine, the $85,000 fine, was the part that hit hardest. It was the sharp reality that no one could ignore. When the HOA was forced to assess each household for a share of the penalty, every homeowner felt the weight of Sylvia's reckless decisions. Suddenly, no one saw her as a misunderstood leader. They saw her for what she was, a person who'd put her pride and profits over the well-being of the entire community. One afternoon, the man with the blue shutters, who had once glared at me for questioning the HOA, knocked on my door. He looked sheepish, almost embarrassed. "I should have spoken up," he said. "You were right. We all knew something was off, but we were too afraid." Others followed. People I hadn't spoken to in years stopped me during walks, offered apologies, shared stories of intimidation and quiet dread. It was healing in an unexpected way. Still, part of me wondered, if just one of them had stood up sooner, would it have come to all this? The financial hit made people reflect. And in that reflection grew resolve. Never again would one person be allowed to accumulate so much unchecked power. There was an unspoken pact between neighbors. If someone started showing signs of Sylvia-style control, they'd be met with swift and unified resistance. And then there was the replanting project. FEMA didn't just replace the lost eucalyptus trees. They brought in a team of environmental planners who designed an entire flood management system tailored to the region's topography. It included strategically placed native flora, reinforced soil barriers, and reintroduced wildlife corridors that would increase biodiversity while also protecting against erosion. Watching those small eucalyptus saplings being carefully planted where my giants had once stood was unexpectedly emotional. Each one represented a piece of the past being reimagined for the future. They weren't just trees. They were symbols of resilience. They were promises that what had been lost could be rebuilt, not the same, but perhaps even better. 3 months after Sylvia's removal, Willow Creek Estates felt reborn. We weren't just a group of property owners anymore. We were neighbors in the truest sense. We started hosting regular town halls, not HOA meetings filled with dread and passive aggression, but genuine gatherings where everyone had a voice. We planted a shared garden. We held weekend cleanups and potlucks. One resident even painted a mural on the community center wall, depicting trees, flowing water, and people holding hands. Ironically, our property values went up. With our new federal environmental designation and growing community spirit, buyers saw value in Willow Creek. Meanwhile, Sylvia's house sat on the market for months before finally selling at a significant loss. When I heard how low she'd sold it for, part of me felt a flicker of sympathy. Losing your home, your title, and your sense of self all at once? That has to be devastating. But then I remembered that spiteful $1,200 violation letter she'd sent me after cutting down my trees, and that sympathy disappeared as quickly as it came. About a year later, I was out in my yard, watering the now 6-foot eucalyptus saplings, when a familiar beat-up sedan pulled to the curb. I squinted, unsure if I was seeing right. And then she stepped out. Sylvia. Older, more tired-looking, and notably without her trademark power suit. She wore jeans and a loose cardigan, her posture uncertain. But on her chest, glinting in the afternoon sun, was the same old HOA president pin. It was both sad and surreal. She approached slowly, as if unsure whether I'd slam the door in her face or call the police. I just stood there, frozen, hose in hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse but steady. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "But before I could even process that," she added, "but you destroyed everything I built here with your cabin drama." I blinked. Was she seriously trying to combine an apology with a guilt trip? "You think you won," she continued bitterly. "But you just got lucky because of some outdated federal paperwork." I took a deep breath and told her what I'd been waiting over a year to say. "I didn't destroy what you built, Sylvia. You did. I just refused to keep calling it a community." She shook her head, unwilling to see it. Unwilling to understand. But then she said something that finally made her motives clear. "It wasn't about the trees," she admitted. "They were blocking lake views. I was going to get a commission if we improved visibility." There it was. The truth. It had never been about safety or aesthetics. It had been about money, real estate profit dressed up as community concern. She left soon after that conversation, and I haven't seen her since. Now, 5 years later, those saplings are towering. Kids climb them. Families picnic beneath them. And I even built a small dock by the lake, called it Rooted. A filmmaker friend helped me make a short documentary about everything that happened. We called it When Communities Fight Back. It's been screened at local festivals and even a few national ones. Apparently, our fight inspired other neighborhoods to challenge their own overreaching HOAs. The biggest lesson I took from it all wasn't about trees or property rights or even federal law. It was about the power of a single no. Sometimes, you don't need a crowd. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up when everyone else stays seated. To speak when silence feels safer. If you've ever faced something like this, if you've stood alone, said enough, or gone head-to-head with a system that forgot it's supposed to serve, you're not alone. This is QE Stories. Thanks for sticking around. If you've got a story like ours, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe. Who knows what story's coming next? The end.